Hey guys, welcome to part 4 on the top 5 martial arts movie stars of the 1990s that weren't Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal. So number 2 on the list is Mark Dacascos. Now of all the guys on this list, he's the most relevant today. In fact, you probably recently seen him as the villain in John Wick 3. Prior to that, he had a really good run in the 90s, namely starting with Only the Strong as being the next big thing. Could have been the next Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal. I'm not going to really focus too much on his straight-to-video films, of which there were many, but I'm going to talk about this theatrical run he had, what happened. But to start off, let's talk about the man, his background, his martial arts, etc., just to kind of get things rolling. So Mark Dacascos is a lifelong martial artist who has won numerous karate and kung fu championships between the ages of 7 and 18. This should not be a surprise, however, as his father, Al Dacascos, is a martial arts instructor who created his own martial arts style called Wun Hop Kuen Do. In addition to that, his stepmother, Malia Bernal, was a martial arts champion and the first female to appear on the cover of Black Belt magazine in September of 1974. When speaking of her, Mark Dacascos says, "I attribute my understanding of how hard and consistent one must work to become good at anything to my mother, Malia Bernal. She walks the talk." As far as his father goes, Al Dacascos built Wun Hop Kuen Do off of a base of Keiji Kenbo, which is a hybrid martial arts style from Hawaii. It's a combination of karate, judo, jiu-jitsu, kenpo, and boxing, which is where the name Keiji Kenbo comes from. So the main difference with the spin-off from Keiji Kenpo is that Al Dacascos' Wun Hop Kuen Do also incorporates even more styles, such as northern and southern styles of kung fu, as well as a Filipino martial art called eskrima. But what really separates his style apart is that it is a martial art that asks you to think for yourself and use your own common sense to actually see what you should do next. It's this type of fluidity and creativity that leads to the ability to respond reflexively to any situation. Needless to say, Mark Dacascos has an extensive background in training in various styles of martial arts. In addition to that, he's also trained in and competed in gymnastics while in college. Although having 2 martial arts champions and instructors in the house while growing up, Mark Dacascos says Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee were huge influences on him. In fact, Jackie Chan was the one that inspired him to get into gymnastics. This just goes to show how powerful movies are, especially to a young, impressionable mind. For me, it was Jean-Claude Van Damme, which inspired me to do the chair splits at this young age here. As far as physical stats go, Mark Dacascos is 5'9", which is right up there with Jean-Claude Van Damme as well as Taekwondo sensation Philip Ree, who I previously covered in part 2 of this series on this channel. As far as what Mark Dacascos weighs, he's kept a pretty consistent build his entire career and is athletic and lean, weighing in the 150s, so he definitely has a physique more akin to Philip Ree, both of whom are less muscled up than the muscles from Brussels, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Now, the previous guys I covered on the list have been pretty easy for Hollywood to categorize. For example, Thomas Ian Griffith as well as Jeff Speakman are both Caucasian and have that all-American look, while Philip Ree is Asian. Now, Mark Dacascos is much more interesting because as far as a casting standpoint goes, he's what Hollywood would say is ethnically ambiguous. But that could work for or against an actor. While it does open the door to play a wider variety of characters with different backgrounds, Hollywood does seem to like to classify and simplify things, which is one reason why you see so many actors get typecast. There's a very interesting article on flickeringmyth.com that talks about this, which I'll link in the description below. It says, there's a certain indefinable quality that works for some in Hollywood, Vin Diesel and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, for example, but put studios off on others, in which is seemingly the case for Mark Dacascos. This undoubtedly worked against him. Not white enough to play an all-American hero, but not Asian enough to play those roles set aside for Asian American actors in the 90s, which were predominantly villains. Philip Ree alluded to this himself, which is why he created his own film company that produced the Best of the Best series. As far as the Flickering Myth article goes, and whether you agree with his assertions or not in reference to Asian Americans being relegated to playing villains in the 1990s, that would definitely have worked against Philip Ree as well as Mark Dacascos, as neither men have that tough, dark, gritty look. In fact, they both seem to encompass good guy qualities. Aside from that, from a physical standpoint, you'd usually want the villain to be physically larger in general, to come across as more of a formidable opponent at first glance. Casting standpoint aside, Mark Dacascos certainly has an interesting background. He was born in Honolulu, Hawaii. His father, Al Dacascos, was of Filipino, Spanish, and Chinese descent, while his mother was of Irish and Japanese descent. In Hawaii, this is known as being a hapa, a term which originated in the 1800s and initially meant being half, but later just meant being mixed, when referring to someone of mixed European and Asian and/or Pacific Islander descent. So today some people find the term endearing while others find it derogatory and offensive. Which, being the year 2020, of course, there's going to be people out there who get offended by this term. Now, I feel comfortable bringing this up and talking about it because I'd be pretty much what you'd classify as a Hapa myself. Even though I'm not from Hawaii, just based on my mixed ethnicity, that's pretty much what somebody would categorize myself. Oh, by the way, there goes some origin on how I came up with my whole Viking samurai moniker, by the way. So going back to Mark Dacascos, he actually became an actor after being discovered walking down the street in San Francisco's Chinatown at the age of 18 by Chris Lee, at that time who was an assistant director, and Rexel Chin, a hairstylist, for director Wayne Wang, who was shooting a movie called Dim Sum, A Little Bit of Heart. Prior to this, Mark Dacascos never acted, and he told the men no thanks, but he accepted their business cards as a courtesy. Later that day, Dacascos says, "I told my mom about it. She showed me I should give them a call, give it a shot, that life is a big adventure and that you don't know if you don't try." Though his first scenes ended up on the cutting room floor, he discovered his second great passion, which was acting. This eventually led him to actually be considered for the role of Bruce Lee in the movie Dragon: The Bruce Lee Story in 1993, though that did not pan out. Instead, that same year, he was cast in the theatrical release Only the Strong. Now this was actually an important film as it introduced the world to a new martial art, never before seen in America's cinemas, Brazilian Capoeira. I have very fond memories of this film myself. At the time, I was the biggest Jean-Claude Van Damme fan, and Bloodsport to me was the greatest martial arts film of all time. Now I heard from an associate at my school who knew I was into martial arts, which he was as well, claimed that this movie called Only the Strong was the greatest martial arts movie of all time. Now of course I thought that was impossible, but he had my curiosity piqued. Little did I know at the time that the writer and director of Only the Strong was the same guy who wrote Bloodsport. Yes, I'm talking about action filmmaker legend Sheldon Lettich. Prior to Only the Strong, Sheldon Lettich not only wrote Bloodsport, but also Rambo 3, another action classic. He would then go on to write and direct Lionheart and then Double Impact, by far two of Van Damme's greatest action films. So prior to Only the Strong getting produced, Mark Dacascos' manager at the time, a woman named Catherine James, heard Sheldon Lettich was getting ready to make another martial arts movie, and that they were looking for a leading actor, who was not going to be Van Damme. So she called Sheldon Lettich and told him about Mark Dacascos, who then drove over to Sheldon's house and introduced himself. So Mark Dacascos trained in Capoeira for 2 months with Master Amon Santo before officially auditioning for the role in Only the Strong. This was followed by an additional 5 months of training after landing the role. Luckily for Mark, he already had extensive experience with gymnastics as well as martial arts, so the transition for him into coming across as a legitimate Capoeira practitioner was a lot easier than it would have been for pretty much anyone else.
I think without some gymnastics background, there's no way I could have done any Capoeira this fast. Definitely not. I mean, just to do a handstand, most people, they make at least a month or so just to get that down. And in Capoeira, everything is, you're either on your hands or flipping in the air, doing split kicks or something. And fortunately, the gymnastics, and we do a lot of that as well.
Now I remember being obsessed with the movie, as well as the soundtrack to Only the Strong, and the film even inspired my brother and I to practice backflips in our front yard. Those were the times. We were eventually able to land them, and thankfully without any formal training as far as flips go, we never ended up breaking our necks. The film was really good. Mark Dacascos showed real charm and charisma as the lead, the story had a good message, the action was fun and exciting. As we have never seen this sort of style of martial art in any film, it was like seeing Aikido for the first time when Steven Seagal burst on the scene with Out for Justice. It was just different. The film had a real budget, which just helps everything shine. However, the problem was the marketing. It was never really given a fair shot. Case in point, here's an interview with Sheldon Lettich. Sheldon Lettich says 20th Century Fox was looking to turn Mark Dacascos into a movie star, headlining studio films for them. Apparently, Rupert Murdoch himself had been impressed enough with Mark's screen test to envision him as a replacement for the recently deceased Brandon Lee, who had starred in Rapid Fire for Fox. But because there had been no advance promotion for the film, with a new star who nobody had ever heard of before, Fox dropped the ball when it came time to actually put the film in theaters. Sheldon Lettich goes on to say that Catherine James, Mark's manager at the time, got signed to do another movie almost immediately after they shot Only the Strong, which was based on the video game Double Dragon. That film was a disastrous train wreck, running way over budget with a schedule that was completely out of control. On top of that, it ended up being a terrible movie and a flop at the box office. Now, Sheldon Lettich goes on to say, the reason I mentioned that movie is that Mark was stuck on it for weeks and weeks beyond their scheduled completion date, and was therefore unable to do any promotion for Only the Strong, which was a pity because the movie went through the roof when 20th Century Fox tested it with a live audience. As I recall, the number of people in the audience who rated it either very good or excellent was around 98%. As a result, the Fox executives were very high on the movie, and they had scheduled me, Mark, and Paco Prieta to do a 3-week promotional tour in 12 cities across the USA. But Mark was inextricably stuck on Double Dragon, so the tour had to be postponed, and postponed again. Eventually, the tour had to be cancelled altogether, and this was all because of Catherine's misguided decision to stick Mark on the terrible train wreck of a movie before Only the Strong had ever been released. To say that Sheldon Lettich is bitter about the whole incident is an understatement, though I'm sure Mark is bitter as well. So because of that whole fiasco, Only the Strong only ended up grossing $3.2 million domestically in 1993. To put that in perspective, Van Damme Had Nowhere to Run come out in 1993, which grossed $22 million, and Steven Seagal, shortly after 94, had On Deadly Ground with a gross of $38.5 million domestically. So Mark Dacascos followed that up in 1994 with Double Dragon, as we talked about, and that fared even worse with just $2.3 million domestically. So Hollywood is very unforgiving, and Mark Dacascos wound up straight to video as a result after the dismal performance of those two films. While it takes numerous people to create a movie, there's usually just a handful that gets all the credit or blame depending on how successful or not a film becomes. One such person is of course the lead star, and in this case, the blame happened to fall on Mark Dacascos for the dismal box office performances of Only the Strong and Double Dragon. Although he never became a household name, or even as big as an action star as Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal, he still ended up with what would be considered a very successful career in film and television. So I mentioned earlier he's had a string of straight-to-video releases after Double Dragon, a string of releases that continues to this day in fact. In addition to that, he'll occasionally appear in a theatrical film, usually as a villain, such as 2003's Cradle to the Grave opposite Jet Li, and more recently 2019's John Wick 3. As far as television goes, you can make the argument that he's found even more success in that arena, appearing in numerous series, such as The Crow, Stairway to Heaven in the late 90s, 2008's The Legend of Bruce Lee as a Thai boxer, Mortal Kombat Legacy in 2013 as Kung Lao. He's also had a recurring role in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Wu Assassins, and Hawaii Five-0. You may have also seen him in the Iron Chef series as the chairman. So what do you guys think about Mark Dacascos overall? Had they properly marketed Only the Strong, do you think his luck would have changed? Could you picture him as a leading man for 20th Century Fox? Let me know in the comments below.